They've only done outside experiences because it's so beautiful to be outside. But it is a little bit harder to have a transformation happen if you're not inside of some kind of a vessel.
It's interesting in some of the work that, there was a lot of exciting work actually going on in England. And Joyce Martin and Pauline McCririck were a couple of psychoanalysts who were looking at something that is a real question for psychedelic medicine, and we're going to have to advance quite a bit before we're in a place where we could even entertain what they were looking at. But what they did was to work with people who were prisoners and often accused of violent crimes. And they did a kind of therapy they called anaclitic therapy. And in anaclitic therapy, what they would do is to foster a regression, and usually an LSD session, where the person would just go back and back and back and back. But what they felt, and their question, which is a real question, is when in the process of psychedelic therapy, when the person, in a sense, transcends time and space or regresses sufficiently or becomes a baby again sufficiently, is it actually possible to do a replacement therapy? Is it actually possible to provide some of the nurturing that wasn't there originally? And everything from psychoanalytic theory and most psychotherapy processes says, no, that's not really going to be possible. You can't sort of fill that emptiness. But Pauline McCririck and Joyce Martin tried it. And they would actually provide a bottle with a nipple, and they would suckle these prisoners when they were regressed. And they got results. They were able to produce changes in character disordered individuals that would be really, really resistant to change otherwise. So there are these kinds of interesting questions that are open, and these definitions of vessel, what kind of a vessel, what kind of a holding environment is necessary to safely do such things, to allow someone to regress so deeply and then to come back. And is it possible? Because certainly the need is there to provide in some way. In our experience with the work with alcoholics and with drug addicts, we seem to find that when people had a mystical experience, that provided a lot of what Joyce and Pauline were trying to provide physically. But that comes in a spiritual way, in the sense of timelessness, in the sense of oneness with God, in the sense of oneness with transcendent love, in the sense of a deep inner source of nourishment, healing, understanding, compassion. Maybe in the end we will find that that is the more desirable process. But I think it's worth examining all of these alternatives. And then the fascinating thing is, as we're going to have more interesting psychopharmacological elements to add with psychedelics, we're going to have euphoriants, we're going to have psychedelic molecules that are quick acting or long acting, and how we're going to integrate these into an informed process. I think it's going to transform the training of professionals, because we need to bring back the stuff that's been thrown out. The takeover of psychiatry by the drug companies and the antidepressant medication and the antipsychotic medication, many of which is incredibly problematic. It is physically challenging to the people that are taking it. That stranglehold has removed psychodynamic understanding, understanding of personality, understanding of developmental psychology, understanding what makes a person has been kind kind of systematically erased from psychiatric training. There are many psychiatric programs now where psychotherapy training consists of medication compliance. You know, how do you get the patient to take the right pill? Not how did they become themselves and who are they, and how might their problem be addressed in order for them to get a hold of the deepest level of positivity in themselves and get a hold of the infinite worth that's in each one of us to give the most that they have to give to life. I think that would be at the core of psychedelic medicine and the practice of it, is to do that for every individual that received treatment. Well, that takes training, and it takes training on the part of the people doing it. You need to understand human development. You need to understand why it is that we build walls against ourselves and how to bring them down in a safe way. And I look forward to that being born now. You know, it's not, the psychedelic renaissance is not really a renaissance yet, it's a resurgence. I want it to be a renaissance. I want it to blossom. I want to see all of this come to fruition. But it's going to be a challenge for all of you, and I'm assuming there are people here that are in the program and want to be trained. I mean, it really demands the most of us to find the highest in ourselves, to be able to give the nurturing and caring, and to be truly curious about what makes a human being, about how it is that people get the idea that they are a certain way, about how it is that each of us decides on certain patterns of being that may not be the best ones, or the ones that we would adopt were we to make the decision today. But many of those patterns are the inheritance from early childhood decisions of protection, and that you know, some understanding of that is set down in psychoanalytic literature and understandings of character armor, but more of it is yet to be understood. We've had real giants in the field, like Stan Grof, who came and handed us a map that takes you deep within a human being and takes you beyond them, and enumerates a lot. But there are ways of extending that map and understanding its links to developmental levels as you're growing, to developmental stages. And a lot of developmental psychology says you have critical phases in development. And when that critical phase is done, it's sealed. You can't do replacement therapy, you can't do anything that is then a sealed issue, and the person goes on to the next challenge in their development. And I think the thing that psychedelics may offer us is a chance to unseal some of that, and to work on those levels. And I think they also offer us a chance to reorient our values. Because in a sense, that development of the human being, the human spirit, is the central tenet that ought to be at the core of society, to develop each of us to the max, you know, to develop our creativity, to develop our sensitivity, and to provide opportunities for that. I know when I began to be interested in psychedelics, one of my professors had a recording of Tim Leary's last academic lecture, and I was shocked to listen to it and have him. He was talking about the possibility of, this is before the age of community mental health centers or anything like that. He was envisioning centers where young adolescents could come to have a psychedelic experience, to, in a sense, have a vision quest and find what they would do with their lives. And such things are possible in a psychedelic culture and in a culture that's aware of the potential of psychedelics. We have a ways to go.
Why don't we open this up to discussion? Because I'm sure everybody has lots of questions, and I'd rather hear your questions and have a good free-flowing discussion here. So, and I mean, I have questions that I can ask some of you too, but I would like to know what kinds of questions you might have.
We have somebody.
Please.
Thank you so much for being here. Do you know of any sort of research with psychedelics and yoga and the effects of breathing and understanding what breath does to our body during psychedelics? And if you know, I would really be appreciated to hear your comments on that.
I don't know of any particular, you know, what's interesting is I think there's just the beginning of research now. So we would love it all if you would go do that. So please, does anybody else here know of any particular, I mean, there might have been some studies back in the 50s and 60s, because there were thousands of studies then. So it's just hard to find them in libraries now. So does anybody know anything about any yoga or breathing studies with any psychedelics?
I know there's mindfulness.
They're
studies that are
mindfulness studies, yeah.
coming underway now,
Mhm.
but none that I know of with yoga.
Yeah.
And long-term meditators.
Yeah.
Long-term meditators, there's actually some good brain scans and actual like pre and post doing things like that, but that would be a wonderful study to do. I would love to see that. Please do that.
I did my own study a while back in the mirror. It was just a pilot.
Thank you for this talk. It's very inspiring, really. There's anecdotal evidence that MDMA seems to lose its euphoric or therapeutic effect over repeated usages. Do you have any insight into that? Is it the case, or what could you talk a little bit about that?
I think that many psychedelics can lose their effectiveness when overused. And certainly there is a lore about MDMA that way. But I think the issue is when we use a psychedelic repeatedly, we build resistances to it. We accommodate, we learn things about it, and those things are not all positive. They're kind of how to be a psychedelic cowboy, how to ride the bucking bronco, rather than how to surrender. And I think the key thing about learning with psychedelics are surrender skills and the capacity to be in the right setting with the right people, to be able to surrender and to be able to open fully. And that repeated use of psychedelics. I remember interviewing one of our subjects in the alcoholism work, interviewing him 35 years after his treatment. Now, it turns out his treatment was filmed by CIIS, so it's complicated. You know, he had LSD therapy, but he was also on national television while he received it. But it was very effective, and he gave up alcohol, and he retrained himself. He was working as a security guard, and he retrained himself as an accountant, and he lived a good life as a loving father, and stayed with his wife and his children, and had a healthy family, and remarkable results. And I said to him, Art, do you think we're working to do some more work with LSD, and it might be possible for you to have another experience with LSD. Would you like to have another experience with LSD? And he said, why would I do that? I had treatment when I was sick, and I needed treatment, and I found out what was going on, and I've lived a good life. Why would I want to take that again? Why would I do that? And I had this moment of awareness that myself and my psychedelic aficionado professional associates, were really the flunkies. That we thought we should, have a few sessions a year at least, and here he was saying, when you get the message, hang up the phone. And I think that there's some aspect of that to be listened to. I'm not saying that what he said is the absolute truth, or that what my friends believe is the absolute truth either, but that there's some quality where if you have a truly profound experience and it truly changes your life is changed. And life is wonderful. Do you want to change your life again? Do you want to have another profound experience? And what is your hunger for a profound experience? And what's at the core of addiction? Because psychedelics are by and large not addictive, we believe. But any addiction is about sort of living at the moment of illusory fulfillment. I'm just about to have a transcendent experience. I'm almost there. Maybe if I have another trip next week, I'll get there. And so there's this place of real growth. I know in the end of my MDA studies with people, we asked them after 4 MDA sessions and 75 hours of therapy whether they'd had enough. And the amazing thing is that most people said yes, maybe not forever, but for now, I've had enough. Now it's interesting in our MDMA studies, and the PTSD sufferers that we're dealing with are people who have much more profound issues than the neurotic patients in my PhD dissertation. But they all say, it was wonderful and I think I could use some more. So it's a real question. When is it enough?
I appreciate the way, am I on?
No.
I appreciate the way you put that out as a very gentle question, because sometimes from people who have gone through their spiritual journey, there's a very kind of authoritarian dictate around that. And sometimes it seems like the Buddhists often have a very kind of rigid notion of if you get the message, hang up the phone. And sometimes I think there's something inherently, well, I don't want to overstate it, but almost kind of racist in that. Because what about all the cultures that, just, it's part of their lifestyle throughout their entire lives. But that reminds me that there's a community level to this, there's a psychodynamic level to this, there's a neuro level to this. And so my comment or question is about that, because I have found your presentation so refreshing, because I get frustrated through the years with the emphasis on the neuroscience. And I understand that that's important, and it's a correlate to the psychodynamic, emotional, developmental experience. But it seems sometimes that the emphasis in the psychedelic, if we want to call it a movement or whatever it is, gets, the emphasis is so often on the neuroscience. And I'm not a neuroscientist. I listen to people like Dennis McKenna when he came, and Dr. Nichols, and I understand maybe 25% of what they're talking about, but they're so brilliant, I enjoy all of it, just sort of sitting with them. But sometimes it seems like the neuroscience claims to understand so much more than they do. And I just appreciate the perspective that you're bringing to the conversation that often doesn't seem to be there. And I just wonder how you see this issue and your place in it. Thank you.
Let's legalize it first, right?
Well, thank you so much for your asking about this and your comment. Let's legalize it first. I think we all have a role to play, and we're all facets of this big beautiful jewel, and we all have to just do all that we can, all the parts that we can, and we have certain things that we can give. That we have certain gifts that I do believe that our soul comes down and comes into this temple of our body, but I can't prove that scientifically, I mean, it's just, every culture, traditional culture in the world feels that way too, but somebody asked Robin Carhart Harris about that question. Robin Carhart Harris is this wonderful psychiatrist who's done fantastic brain imaging studies with magnetoencephalography, showing that the default mode network is the one that's our ego, and it gets shut down under the influence of psychedelics, and which allows the subcortical structures to come forward and be activated. And somebody asked him, do you think that there is anything beyond the brain? Are people receiving information beyond the brain? And he said, I don't think so. And he was pretty sure, absolutely not. And he's a young man, so hopefully he'll grow into it.
Well, he's so beautiful in the thinking that he is doing about the nature of ego, where he has really refined the notion. I mean, it's only a proposal, but that ego is really our predictive engine. That part of this thing when I'm describing character and personality, that where we're protecting ourselves and we're navigating in a description of ourselves and the world, he said ego is really this predictive engine, and as long as the predictions that ego is making are correct, then it kind of dampens activity and it moderates everything in the brain, and the default mode network, which is kind of like this giant switchboard that's connecting all the parts of the brain, just sort of idles along and everything is fine. And then when something happens that isn't predictable, that ego wasn't able to predict, that's when the psychedelic things start to happen to the default mode network. The action of psychedelics can just do that straight out through the action of psychedelics. It sort of dampens this part of the mind that is really like Aldous Huxley's idea of the reducing valve, that really our brain is kind of a reducing valve, that rather than being an amplifier, it's actually dampening things down. So when the dampening stops happening, that's when things get interesting. That's when the lower structures spring up, all of the fascinating stuff. That's when things like the hippocampus that are associated with learning mazes in a rat, but they're probably associated with memories for us in childhood that ordinarily wouldn't be there. When the default mode network loses its pattern, this stuff burbles up. It's waiting there to be resolved. The Gestaltists used to talk about unfinished business. It's like this unfinished business is in our nervous system, and it is there, and it's just waiting to come out, but it has to have an opportunity to come out. And psychedelics can provide that opportunity. But science, our Western science, is a material base, and our societies are enthralled with materialism. And these compounds, wherever they've been used successfully in human history, have been seen as somehow sacred and somehow special. And whether it's our Food and Drug Administration or our scientists, we want to say, no, these are drugs, they're like any other drugs, they can be understood, and we'll understand them, and we'll dominate them, and then there's this other side where, no, this is miraculous, this is, God whispering, or God yelling, or, this is the flesh of the gods. Oh, no, it's the 5-HT, 1A, 2C, there's now 22 different varieties of serotonin, and you know, it's we're just about to understand it. We're just about to wrap it up, and we'll really grasp it in a material sense. And of course, the wonderful thing is that we're far from that.
But there is a really good talk by Robin Carhart Harris on YouTube where he shows you all the brain pictures. It was the talk that he gave in 2013 at the Psychedelic Science Conference, the MAPS conference. So look up Robin Carhart Harris, 2013. And it's very interesting because he goes through actually explaining very well the different brain networks, the one that associates with the external world and the one that is our internal world, that's the default mode network. And when those two actually, instead of opposing each other in their frequencies, they actually start coming together and collapse, that's when we can't tell where we end and the whole rest of everything begins. And suddenly we feel one with everything. But that's not really true, it's just our brain chemistry. So it's real, I mean, but it's fascinating. So, I mean, philosophically, what does that mean, you know? So, anyway.
It's like the psychedelic drug ketamine. You know, when someone receives this drug, and so many people have received it for major surgery and with no preparation at all at times, and other people have received it as a psychedelic, it creates an experience of your consciousness existing without your body. And it has a property that is not like, would you like to go this way and have this experience? And it's more like, we're going this way. There we are. We have this experience. I've likened it to a cosmic ring or washer. You know, you get your little finger caught in it, and the next thing you know, you're gone. Westerners tend to come back from such an experience and say that was a very interesting drug experience. And it's a way to put it on the shelf. And in subjective terms, the underpinnings of our entire worldview were just shattered. Indisputably so. Subjectively real experience. And yet, the power of our worldview is enough that we can say, that was an interesting drug experience, and drive home. And so, you know, we have a lot of learning possible in altered consciousness work that is like that. It isn't necessarily you have to have another ketamine experience. It's really maybe you need to think about what the experience you had means and about the difference between what's real for you in your own mind and your own experience and what the official story is.
Hello? Yeah, it is. Okay. Yeah, hi. It's great, yes. I was just piggybacking. You were thinking a little bit about your statement about when you get the message, hang up the phone. I think it's an Alan Watts quote. I have to talk about a little bit of the context.
That is from Alan Watts.
That's an Alan Watts quote.
At least that's who I'm quoting.
Yeah, that's the context. And of course, he came from a particular background, pretty linear Western background. So one day in a conversation, I asked Terrence McKenna, I said, hey, Terrence, what do you think of this Alan Watts quote about when you get the message, hang up the phone? And he said, I'm still getting good messages. So, you know, okay. So like it opens that door to the mysterium tremendum, you know. It says like, okay, are we gonna take that leap or not? And I think that we tend to want to, like you said, compartmentalize or put it on the shelf, is that what you said? Yeah, put it on the shelf, and okay, we did that, been there. And that's interesting to me, and I'm finding actually with some older folks, oh, I've done that already. I'm through with that. And I see that.
That's sad.
I think so too. But I think it's also interesting in that, you know, I think some of us who have done many psychedelic medicines over many years, we realize that they can be occasionally scary. And you know, like people say, well, how do you? I did a panel one time with Rick and Dobbin at the DPA, and it was on how to avoid bad trips. And that was the name of the panel. And so, what's interesting though, and I'd like to know what you guys think about this, is like, what is a bad trip? I said there is no bad trips. There's terrifying trips. There's difficult ones. And so, what's been your experience with that?
Sometimes the best trip is a bad trip.
Yeah. I mean, people
I mean,
call
the
it.
judgment of what is a good trip. Is a good trip what you wanted? And what is a bad trip? Is a bad trip not what you wanted? Is a bad trip something that maybe teaches you about edges that are uncomfortable in yourself and or difficult experiences that you had? But that bad trip needs work. Maybe the good trip does too. But the bad trip needs work. It needs understanding. It needs care. It needs framing. It needs examination. It shouldn't be discarded if it was laden with such powerful emotion and avoidance. You shouldn't need to avoid anything. I mean, I think that's one of the guidelines that we use in working with psychedelics with people is don't turn away from any internal experience. Go find what that experience has for you. And, you know, people talk about guiding somebody, you know, it's not about, why don't you go over there because there's a pass through there. It's more like you're having an experience, and that's an important experience to have. How can I help you to have that experience more intensely? How can I help you to recognize the wisdom of the experience that you're having, rather than maybe the experience you think you want to have, or the experience you want to avoid, or something else? No, it's about surrendering to what is.
Yeah, most of the people who have described bad trips to me have not had an alchemical vessel within which to have that experience. Because if you have something that's holding you that securely and safely that you have made sure you set up for yourself and you took responsibility to make sure was there, then you get to transform and go through to the end of the experience and come out the other side. But I think that a lot of people, I mean, it's not easy to find a sacred space, you know, it's not easy to find that kind of a safe and sacred place and a safe person to do it with. And I think the choice to do it anyway, instead of waiting for the sealed vessel, is really important. And I think that also the surrender skills, I think people, when you're resisting and something is scarier and scarier and scarier and you're not safe enough to really let go, the resistance tends to feel like hell realm. I mean, it's really it's the pushing against something and holding on that tends to make it worse and worse and worse, and feel like you're stuck. You know, you're like shoved into some really awful place or trapped, or, you know. So I think that it has so much to do with the setting being, I mean, the alchemical vessel, like vesseling inside of vesseling. And as a therapy person, I think of myself being held inside of other vessels, like in institutional settings. I've been, for example, I've been a medical director for a foster care program for 18 years in Baltimore, where the kids in that program were from very violent homes in Baltimore and near DC. And at a certain point, I was not being held in a safe enough place in that institution to really work with that kind of kid anymore, and I had to get out. And the same thing happened when we moved to Canada. I was working with the Ministry of Children and Families, and at a certain point, there were things happening which made me not feel safe. So that's a vessel. I think that we all work inside of all kinds of vessels, and our culture is like a vessel in some ways. So where are our safe places, and how can we make them more safe for each other?
And that's one of the most hopeful things about what seems to be changing now in the vessel of our culture, is that suddenly folks like me are elders, and we've had psychedelic experience, and we're not frightened by it, and we know it has potential, and we know it has value, and the culture softens. It's not there yet, but it's softening, and the opening is there, the possibility is there. The possibility to open and find ways to hold these medicines again in a way that serves people. And I think that there's wonderful science to be done. There's amazing, cannabinoid medicine, oh my God, discovering that cannabis and cannabinoids, it's a major neurotransmitter system. Most physicians don't even know it exists. And it's major. And it has to do with tumor regulation, and it has to do with affect regulation, and it has to do, and it has to do, and it has to do with so many different things. And psychedelics in a similar way. They talked a while back about the era of the brain and understanding the brain. Well, this is the era of consciousness. And like some of the remarkable work that Robin Carhart Harris is doing is about, beginning links between what's happening in the brain and what's happening in consciousness. It's not one for one. It's not that little carbuncle over there, that's when Richard was 4 and this happened, It's not that specific, but it's really interesting stuff about levels of consciousness and this kind of mental apparatus we have that is so phenomenally complex, where we have more neurons in our brain than there are stars in the universe. My God.
There's somebody back here. Baker?
Okay, I know there are a lot of questions. I'm going to try to keep this one short. Earlier on, you did talk about having a co-therapist and the importance of that. Just want to learn a little bit more about how that works. Do the co-therapists get to ask questions? Do they just take notes? Do they build relationships with the patients? Do they discuss with the other therapist at the end?
Those are good questions, but we were the co-therapists with each
Those
other.
are great
so.
questions. Donna and I are co-therapists. And, there's times when I feel like I sort of think I know what to do. I'm occasionally right. Certainly there are times when she feels like she knows what to do and she's right. And there are times when we sort of watch out for each other. But it's not about the co-therapist as less than. And certainly over the length of my career, I've lived through times like, for instance, when I mentioned Nancy Jewell, who's just a wonderful, wise person, but someone without very much education. But she was certainly an equal in the process of doing therapy. She, I was a bright young guy with education, and she was the grandmother with years of psychedelic experience in addition to all of her years of experience working with patients and caring for them in different settings, let alone all of the psychedelic sessions that she sat for. I'll never forget a psychiatrist friend was having a training session there, and he walked in, and he kind of had this cocky way of carrying himself, So, hi, Nancy, Corey Davis here, I'm a psychiatrist, and just had an LSD session. And she said, well, LSD is very interesting, but And I thought DPT was quite interesting too, but the one that I really liked the most was MDA, and that was really, and I just watched his jaw drop, you know, as this little grandma from West Virginia with her drawl just completely outdid him in psychedelic experience, but in a kindly perspective on what the qualities were, the different compounds that were really helpful or useful. And I think that co-therapist means two therapists.
But I wonder if what you're asking about is if there's a therapist with lots of experience and another therapist who has a lot less experience, what would it be like? Is that more what you're asking about?
Well, in general,
Yeah.
is it like that, or is it two therapists with a lot of experience?
Well, I think it's lots of different combinations. I just think that when there are two people in the room, and there's always, you know, in terms of preparation, there's a lot of discussing ahead of time how you'd like to hold the person together. And it also depends upon how the person is interacting with each of the people. Like we had some men in the study that we did who would relate to me in a certain way because of, you know, being the woman in the situation. And there were certain projections about mother or sister or wife or whatever. And then there were certain things that the men had with Richard as father or brother. And so you're there really as somebody to hold the person together. And I think for people who are younger therapists, it's always great to be able to sit with somebody who's doing something that you don't really know very well, so you really observe them. It's so intimate. It's like right up close, and you get to see, you know, and then you get to discuss afterwards, okay, now why did you say that then? Or what was going on? Or what were you thinking when he said that, or when this happened? And so it's a fantastic learning experience. Does that answer a little bit more of what you're asking? Thanks.
And it's also, you know, male, female therapist, co-therapist team, mom and pop. You know, it's like resting on some proven principle of nurturing in human beings. We need both elements present, and it provides perspective and the capacity to hold more. And if one person is threatened, perhaps the other one isn't so threatened in the therapist, co-therapist team. And then that can work to help work it through and make sure that the person who's in the role of patient gets what they need out of it.
Yeah, it's helpful if the people can be somewhat matched, complementary in terms of skills sets in a little bit. I mean, there are situations in which I think, like for the study that we just are finishing in Vancouver, I feel like it challenged me in all of the different ways that I know how to be a therapist. And, you know, this is after working with people for 30 years. And there were things that I knew about that it seemed like Richard was like, oh God, what am I going to do now? What should we say now? And I was able to come forward, and it seemed like complementary in some way. So.
And I hope vice versa.
Yeah. So, right back there.